I'm Joshua Bardwell, and you're going to learn something today. I'm going to tell you about Dshot in this video. Now, this is part 2 of a series. In part 1, I talked about the protocols that came before Dshot, the analog protocols like Multishot and One-Shot. And as much as I know you want to get right into learning about Dshot, I would suggest you go back and watch that video first so that you can have a better perspective on where we've come from and what is wrong with what we're doing now that Dshot is going to fix. Okay? So if you haven't watched that, go ahead and watch that. And if you have watched that, now you're back. Hi, welcome back. Let's talk about Dshot. We'll start by defining what is an analog versus a digital protocol. And there's a lot of different ways we could give that definition. We're not going to go into all of that. That's Computer Science 101. For the sake of this discussion, let's say that analog directly represents the information with a physical characteristic of the signal, in this case, the pulse length. And if we go back to Multishot and One-Shot and so on, we'll see that the throttle value, which is the thing that they're trying to represent, is always directly represented by the length of the pulse in the motor signal. Sometimes it's 1,000 to 2,000 microseconds. Sometimes it's 125 to 250 microseconds, as in One-Shot, etc., etc. But there's always a direct relationship between the length of the pulse and the throttle value that we're trying to encode. Digital indirectly represents the information by interpreting the signal as numbers, and the numbers themselves represent the information that we're trying to encode. Again, that is the throttle value. So the analogy that I've made here on this slide is if you were to ask the question, how big of a pizza do you want? One way to answer that question is to just hold up your hands and go, this big. I have a very small camera angle here. Normally pizza is bigger than that, but then my hands would be out of the camera. So this big, this is how big of it's a personal pizza. Okay. At which point the pizza maker goes, okay, I'm going to make you a pizza that big. He makes a pizza that big. Now that's analog. I just showed him how big a pizza I want. With digital, I encode the information numerically. So with digital, I would say, how big of a pizza do you want? 14 inches. I want 14 inches. Now, you're probably thinking, wait a minute, no, digital is ones and zeros. And yeah. No, digital is ones and zeros. The ones and zeros are what we use to encode the information. But the characteristics of analog and digital that I want to focus on right here is that analog directly represents the information using some physical characteristic of the signal, whereas digital encodes numbers that tell you about the information. The signal itself does not directly represent the information. Now, you may be looking at my pizza analogy and thinking, well, analog is imprecise. Like, how big a pizza do you want? This big. No, that's not what I mean. Whereas digital, we're like 14.0 inches. No. Digital and analog can both be either precise or imprecise. And I'll give you another analogy for that. Let's say that a tailor is going to make you a pair of pants, and the tailor measures your inseam. And what they do is, let's say they take a string and they run the string down your inseam, and they measure how long your inseam is. Now, they could use a ruler, right, to get a numerical value. That would be more like digital. But let's say they just take a string and they run the string down, and then the length of the string is the length of your inseam. That could be as precise as you want, right? The length of that string could be exactly as precisely long as your inseam. Or it could be imprecise. Maybe they cut a little longer, a little short. See, analog or digital has nothing to do with the precision or the imprecision of the number. They can both be precise or imprecise. That's not the point. Now let's talk about some of the problems with analog protocols. One of the problems is that analog protocols are prone to miscalibration. For example, a flight controller could generate a 1, 2, 3, 4 microsecond pulse. The ESC times the pulse. How long is the pulse? Well, if their clocks are not running at exactly the same speed, the ESC will not read 1, 2, 3, 4 microseconds. And you can imagine that at the microsecond level, it's very easy for their clocks or their oscillators to be running at slightly different speeds. There are various ways to solve this problem. One is to have a shared clock signal, which is sent from the flight controller to the ESC. And in computers, that's a thing that is commonly done, but that is not something that's done between our flight controllers and our ESCs for various reasons, which we won't go into. Another way to solve the problem is to use expensive calibrated oscillators. You can buy oscillator chips and they're guaranteed to be calibrated to an exact certain frequency, and that's just it. Well, we're not doing that on our ESCs either. That's very expensive. The way that we solve this problem is we do calibration. We perform ESC throttle calibration. So when you do the thing where you raise the throttle all the way and then you plug the battery in and the ESCs do their beeps and then you lower the throttle, you're calibrating the oscillators between the flight controller and the ESC. You're compensating for any difference. If the ESC is running 3% slower than the flight controller, they'll figure that out, and then everything will work fine going forward. But that's not perfect. Number one, calibration is a pain in the butt. Although calibration is not a fundamentally complicated thing, you'd be surprised, or maybe you wouldn't be surprised, how much effort is spent explaining calibration to people who are new to the hobby and explaining the right way to do it and why you can't do it this way or that way. The other thing is that calibration is not perfect. The oscillators, as their temperature changes, their speed changes. So you could calibrate your ESCs in the summer and the winter and get different values, perhaps. So it's not perfect. Some people say, well, you don't even need to calibrate. Come on, it's close enough, isn't it? Right? In my experience, if I set the throttle channel to 1,000 to 2,000 microseconds and then calibrate ESCs, and as you might imagine, I do a lot of builds and I calibrate a lot of ESCs, I typically see about 1016 or 1020 on the bottom and between 2020 and 2,000 on the top. Maybe I've seen as much as 40 microseconds of difference between the flight controller and the ESC on the top end. In other words, the flight controller is at 1980 microseconds and the ESC calibrates to 2020. So I think that calibration, no, you can't just skip it. It's absolutely an issue. Depending on your flight controller and your ESC, there can be pretty substantial differences in their timing that I think would affect flight in small ways, not major ways, but small ways. Another problem with analog protocols is background noise. There's electrical noise in the system, and there's electrical noise in every system, but especially in quadcopters with ESCs and so on. Lots of noise. And the noise limits the possible precision of the analog signals. To go back to the pizza analogy, if we asked, how big a pizza do you want? And the guy said, this big, because it was cold and he was shivering. Well, how big a pizza do you want? You'll get it close, but not as close as if his hands were steady. And that's an analogy for what the background noise is. So this is actually an answer to the question, what's the possible benefit to running the motor updates faster than the PID loop? Some people have said if you're only running the PID loop at, say, 4 kilohertz or 8 kilohertz, what's the point of running unsynced motor output at 32 kilohertz? You're just repeating the same value again and again and again. And the answer is, if there is noise in the system, then a value that I transmit will not be accurately received. If I send a motor signal 1, 2, 3, 4, you might receive it as 1, 2, 3, 6, 1, 2, 3, 2, 1, 2, 3, 5, 1, 2, 3, 3. And if I send that value multiple times, the noise will average out around the correct value. This kind of is a form of dithering, thanks to a YouTube commenter who suggested that analogy. It is. I think it's a form of dithering. So to the people who said there's no possible point in running 32 kilohertz if your PID loop is only at 8 kilohertz because you're just repeating the same value again and again and again. And other people said, people like Ryan Harrell, Quad McFly, said, I don't know. I think there's a difference. Well, this is a explanation for what the difference might be. Analog noise like this affects shorter pulses like One-Shot 42 and Multishot more than longer pulses, relatively speaking. And the reason for that is that if you slice off, a half a microsecond from the end of the pulse, well, if it's a 5 microsecond pulse, that's a pretty big chunk of the pulse. Whereas if it's a 2,000 microsecond pulse, that's not much at all. Alrighty then, what is Dshot? Dshot is a digital protocol for transmitting throttle values from the flight controller to the ESC. And Dshot comes in 3 speeds, Dshot 150, Dshot 300, and Dshot 600, where 150 is the slowest and 600 is the fastest at 8, 16, and 32 kilohertz maximum update rate. Can you use Dshot? Can your flight controller even support it? Not all flight controllers do. Dshot uses something called Direct Memory Access, DMA, to allow the flight controller to send a high bitrate digital protocol without overloading the CPU. This is actually kind of a misuse is too strong of a word. It's a novel and creative use of DMA. It's a non-traditional use of DMA for what we're doing, but it gets the job done. So, good, kudos. It's a clever approach. The DMA capabilities are a function of the processor. And you talk about the number of DMA channels that a processor has. F1, F3, F4. In general, the bigger processors have more DMA channels. The board designer decides what processor pins to map to what resources. So, for example, one of the processor pins will go to one of the motor outputs, and one of the processor pins will go to the PPM input, and so on and so on and so on. And the way the board designer makes those choices affects how the DMA channels are allocated to different resources. And this is not something that people thought about in this way before Dshot came to the table. And so it's a little bit of a crapshoot. If you're lucky, then the way the board designer mapped the DMA channels to the individual resources, it turns out that we can go ahead and we can use Dshot on the board with no modifications. With other boards, there's conflicts. So, for example, some of the motor outputs might be set up in such a way that they're sharing the same DMA channel, in which case they would not be able to be used for Dshot because each of the motor outputs needs to be on a separate DMA channel for Dshot. At least that's how I think it works. Whereas for normal motor outputs, DMA is not being used. So you could put all 4 of the motor outputs on one DMA channel and it wouldn't really matter. You're not using DMA anyway, so who cares? That's why some of these boards support Dshot, other boards don't support Dshot. And some boards, they will support Dshot, but you'll lose some functionality like black box or LED strip, again, because there's a conflict between that was using the DMA channel, but now you're going to use that for motor output instead. Some flight controllers can support Dshot if you use the Betaflight 3.1 resource command to remap the motor outputs to a different pin or pad. So this is something I'll do a video on eventually. Betaflight 3.1 has the ability to remap outputs and inputs, essentially arbitrarily, like real remapping, not just custom motor mixes like we've done in the past, but actual remapping. So you can say motor output number 4 gets moved to the PPM input pin. Why would you do that? I don't know. You know all the junk we've had to do with CC3D and OpenPilot boards with the buzzer on pin 6 and where's my buzzer going to be? Well, now with the resource, you can just put the buzzer wherever you want it. Well, we could also move some of this stuff around to free up the DMA channels that we need to do Dshot. So what flight controllers support Dshot? Well, the answer is it's an ever-changing list. Go to the wiki. The wiki is linked here. This is for Betaflight, of course. Go to the wiki and just look it up and read it. There's so many permutations here, I couldn't possibly begin to tell you which ones do and don't, and by the time I made the video, it might have changed. So just go look in the wiki and see. That's for Betaflight, of course. The KISS flight controller with firmware 103 supports Dshot. And Raceflight 1 supports Dshot. Raceflight 1 is not released yet, but the Raceflight devs, my contact with the Raceflight devs tells me that Raceflight 1 supports it, and it is possible for some people who are testers to get copies of that and test that out. Perhaps that's something you could do if you're interested. What ESCs support Dshot? KISS 24 ESCs with custom firmware from flyduino.net support Dshot. And Betaflight, in this new spirit of cooperation, yay, I love it, between KISS and Betaflight. In case you don't know, Felix and Boris, the KISS developers and the Betaflight developers, which is a shorthand way of saying that, have been working very closely together on the development of Dshot, and I think it's fantastic to see 2 big participants in the hobby, especially a closed source and an open source one, working together to create this thing that's moving the hobby forward. KISS has supported Dshot before Betaflight did, and now Betaflight has support as well. Betaflight 3.1 has KISS pass-through feature. So Betaflight's had BL-Heli pass-through forever. If you're running KISS ESCs with a Betaflight flight controller, you can flash the KISS ESCs using pass-through, similar to how you flash BL-Heli with pass-through, and that's pretty cool. BL-Heli S ESCs, most of them can support Dshot. Well, I think it's fair to say all of them can support Dshot, but some of them only support the slower speeds like Dshot 150 or Dshot 300. And I'm going to talk later in the video about whether it's worth using Dshot if you can only do Dshot 150. Okay, so all BL-Heli ESCs should support Dshot, but some of them may not support the faster speeds. You do need custom firmware. You can download that firmware from the BL-Heli GitHub, but I think the easiest thing to do is to get the BL-Heli GUI Chrome app, and that will let you flash it just from a pull-down menu. And I think that's easier than trying to download the file from GitHub or whatever. But if you have any issues with the BL-Heli GUI Chrome app, then you can just download it from GitHub. Very few older ESCs, BL-Heli S ESCs, support Dshot 600 without modification. And by modification, I mean you have to remove a capacitor. I'll talk more about that coming up soon. Many newer ESCs that are just coming to market are supporting Dshot 600 without any modification. So some that I know of are the FPV model Quadrant 25 amp, the DYS XSD series, and that was actually the first one that I ever heard of, and the little b BL-Heli 4N1, the BL-Heli S 4N1 ESC. This is another one that's just released. Saw it on Facebook. And of course, the first question I ask when I see a new ESC these days is, does it support Dshot 600 without modification? I know that there are others out. This hobby moves too fast for me to keep up. I know there are others out there. And frankly, I think you can assume that basically every BL-Heli S ESC released from now on will support Dshot 600 without modification. That certainly seems to be what vendors are doing. But it always makes sense to ask. And you also have to be very careful when you ask. When you ask a vendor, does this ESC support Dshot 600? The ESC that I'm thinking of is the Racer Star. And again, this is, I don't have personal experience with this, just sort of reading and picking up information from the RC groups and so on. I think the Racer Star is sold as supporting Dshot 600, but only if you remove a capacitor. So does it, I mean, you have to ask, does this ESC support Dshot 600 without modification out of the box? Because the marketing materials might be a little bit dishonest. What about regular BL-Heli? What about Simon K? Simon K, right? No. BL-Heli and other ESCs other than KISS and BL-Heli S, they're not going to support Dshot. The processor can't handle it. There's various technical permutations. I suppose it's possible that 3 months from now, somebody will magically make it happen and we'll all be amazed and they said it couldn't happen. But for now, assume that it's not going to happen. Don't hold your breath for it. If you have regular BL-Heli ESCs, you cannot run Dshot today, and you are not expected to be able to run Dshot at any point in the future. If you have BL-Heli S ESCs, there may be hope for you. And if you're buying new ESCs, buy one that supports Dshot out of the box. What about that pesky capacitor? Let's talk more about that. Most BL-Heli ESCs have a filter capacitor on the signal input, and the intent there is that it will filter out noise. Noise is high frequency usually, and the filter capacitor is essentially just a low-pass filter that filters out high frequency noise. Well, if a signal gets fast enough, like a high frequency digital signal, like a high bitrate digital signal, oh yeah, then you'll end up with, it'll look like noise and it'll get filtered as well. And so we see over on the right here, we've got the unfiltered Dshot 300 signal. This is an oscilloscope showing the signal that's actually being transmitted, right? And here's what the capacitor is doing to it. That's not right. It's screwing it up. And this is only Dshot 300. At Dshot 600, it would be even worse. So the filter capacitor that's trying to help by getting rid of noise is no longer helping and it needs to be removed. And in fact, what will happen is if you try and run Dshot 600 or Dshot 300 into an ESC that can't take it, the motors may twitch, they may not spin at all, stuff won't be right, okay? So you've got to remove the capacitor. The exact way to remove the capacitor varies, Well, the way to remove it is there's various ways to remove it. By the way, it's not trivial to remove the capacitor without damaging the ESC, which is why if you're not very confident in your ability to work with surface mount components, it may be worth it just for you to go ahead and just buy a new set of ESCs, right? Why not? They just buy some that's supported out of the box and then just put them on. But if you're willing to take a chance, you can go in there with your soldering iron. And the trick with the soldering iron is that you have to desolder both sides of the capacitor at once. And it's hard. You'll flow one and then you'll flow the other, but then the other one will harden. You can cut it off the board with a razor knife or an X-Acto knife if you're very careful. Some people just take diagonal cutters and snip it right in half. There are various things to do. The wiki talks about it. Kudos to the people who maintain the wiki. By the way, they're doing a hell of a job. I got a lot of the information for this presentation from the wiki. They don't get nearly enough credit. Kudos to them for that. So you can read about various ways to remove it, but the bottom line, you take your ESC into your own hands and you do the best you can and you see how it comes out. The trick is knowing which capacitor to remove. Now, there are instructions for 30 ESCs showing you which capacitor to remove on the wiki. If you don't have one of those ESCs, there are instructions on the wiki for how to go in with a multimeter and find the capacitor on your ESC if you're a brave person. So all that information is there, and I won't be going into it in this video because there's just too much information to really go into in a video like this. It used to be said that once you remove that capacitor, there's no going back. You're committed to Dshot. And the reason people thought that was that people thought that the noise, the electrical noise in the systems would be so bad that your traditional analog protocols would be very no good. They'd be no good. Well, that statement may have been a little strong. There are people, in fact, again, my contact with the raceflight dev says he feels like Multishot actually runs even better with these filter caps removed than it did with the filter caps on. That Multishot itself was high enough frequency that it was getting affected by these filters, although we just didn't know it at the time. Whether you can go back, whether you can run the ESCs without the filter caps depends entirely on how much electrical noise your copter has, and that's something no one can predict for you. But it's not a given that if you remove the filter cap that you're committed to Dshot. Many people have removed the filter cap and then for whatever reason they go back to running Multishot or perhaps even one shot, I don't know, and it works okay. That being said, if you remove the filter cap, then it probably Dshot is where you want to be, right? So that's where you should be. What do you have to do to configure Dshot once you've got all this stuff? You've got the right firmware, you've got the flight controller selected, the ESCs flashed, yada, yada, yada. Nothing special really needs to be done on the ESCs. In BL Heli, you used to have to set the ppm min and max to 1000 and 2000, but now the later versions of the firmware, which is what you'll be flashing if you're doing it after watching this video, they just took out the ppm min and the max when you're using Dshot. And of course, the reason for that is that the endpoints of the channel are fixed. It's a digital channel. We don't need calibration anymore, right? That's the whole point. In Betaflight, instead of min throttle, now we've got this parameter digital idle percent. Digital idle percent is exactly like min throttle. It's the value, it's the idle speed that keeps your motors from stopping when you're flying, when you lower the throttle all the way down. Digital idle percent is, as far as I know, only available in the command line. You need to set it manually in the command line. Of course, eventually it'll be in the configurator. You'll just use the same way that you set min throttle in the configurator now. You'll set the digital idle percent. Min command and max throttle are ignored in Betaflight when Dshot is used because, again, the throttle channel has fixed endpoints. We don't need to calibrate anymore. You can change those values, but they won't do anything if you're using Dshot. Adjust the digital idle percent the same way that you adjust bin throttle. You need to raise digital idle percent if the motors don't spin smoothly when you arm or if the copter tumbles after flips and rolls. And likewise, you can lower the digital idle percent if you want to make the copter drop out of the air faster when you chop the throttle. Unsynced motor output is no longer available when Dshot is selected, and the argument goes that unsynced motor output is no longer needed. The only reason that you might need unsynced motor output is in an analog protocol if you want to retransmit the same value again and again and again as a sort of a form of error correction or dithering. We talked about that. With Dshot, you transmit the binary digital value and it gets to the other end, and there you go, right? So what's the point in retransmitting it? I actually think this is an interesting question here, which is that, digital signals can still get corrupted. So let's say you're running your PID loop at 8K. Maybe you would like to run the Dshot output at 16K. On the off chance that something gets corrupted, then you'll retransmit the value in half the amount of time. I don't know, but I'm going to leave this to the devs at this point. It's not available. What are the advantages of Dshot? Well, let me sum it up for you. Calibration of ESC endpoints is not necessary. Exact throttle values are transmitted and received. And for all the focus on flight performance, I think that the convenience of never having to calibrate your ESCs may actually turn out to be the biggest advantage of Dshot. It's not sexy, but it's the one that's going to save us a lot of day-to-day trouble. With digital protocols, electrical noise cannot change a throttle value. Values received are always exactly what was sent. So with an analog protocol, if you're sending a throttle pulse and electrical noise changes the voltage level, the throttle pulse ends early and the ESC receives an incorrect value. You were sending 1500 microseconds and the ESC read 1100 microseconds. And yes, a few microseconds later, it's going to get the next value and it'll correct itself. But it's a little glitch there, isn't it? It's a glitch in the values that the ESC will show up in a lack of smoothness in the motor output, for example. So in this case, the values received are always exactly what was sent. The ESC can detect and reject throttle data corrupted by noise because this digital protocol has a checksum, which means that corrupted data will be detected and it'll be rejected. So bad data will never get through. We may lose data, but bad data will never get through. Finally, Dshot gives us the possibility for digital communication between the flight controller and the ESC. So for example, we could have a scenario where the flight controller tells the ESC that it wants it to beep a certain tone. We could use the motors and the ESCs instead of our beeper, for example, or it could make it play music, or we could make it give status updates through the motors. They could beep certain status symbols through the motors. Anyway, that's the kind of thing that when you have digital communication between the flight controller and ESC, you can do that. And Dshot has been engineered to include command bytes, command words that open the door for this in the future, although it hasn't been implemented yet. Did you notice that nowhere in here did I ever talk about butter smooth, locked in, ball ripping on rails flying? Where are the flight advantages of Dshot? Are there any? In part one of this series, I argued that reduced delay was the main advantage of one-shot and multi-shot, not faster updates. Less time elapsing between the PID loop calculating and outputting a new motor value that it wants the motor to spin faster or slower right now to respond to some aerodynamic condition, and that the reduced delay was the main advantage, not the faster updates. If we look at this chart here, we can see here's the timing for Dshot 600, 300, and 150, and we can see that only Dshot 600 even comes close to Multishot. So you could make an argument that if you're running Multishot, that is Dshot 150 even, is it better? Because it's like 3 or 4 times as much latency. Interesting question. Because of this reduced latency, you should still run Dshot 600 if you can, even if you're running the PID loop at less than 32 kilohertz. And there are people who say, my ESCs can only support Dshot 150. But that's okay because Dshot 150 goes up to 8 kilohertz and I'm only running the PID loop at 4 kilohertz. So it's all good, right? No. There is still an advantage to running Multishot, to go back to the analog protocols. There's still an advantage to running Multishot, even if you're not running at 32 kilohertz, because the pulse is shorter. Shorter pulses mean you can send them more often, but you don't have to. Shorter pulses have an advantage even if you are only sending them every so often and not as often as you can. So you should still run Dshot 600 if you can, even if you're running the PID loop at less than 32 kilohertz, because the shorter pulses will give you a flight advantage. I feel confident saying that because I've demonstrated this by comparing one shot to multi-shot, and there's definitely an advantage. So I feel confident saying that there ought to be an advantage between, say, Dshot 150 and Dshot 600. Okay, well then, is there a night and day difference or not? Because when the new protocol comes out, all the pilots post videos and they go, oh, Dshot, so good, OMG, 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 OMG. And I saw a video somebody made. I wish I could link it here, but I don't remember. He posted the same flight video 4 times in a row. And he was like, oh, here's my comparison. Multi-shot, one shot, Dshot, right? It was literally the same video 4 times in a row. It was like, okay, can you really tell the difference? And some people say, nah, I didn't really tell the difference. And some people say, oh my God, yes, such a difference. Why? What's going on here? How can they both be right? Here's what I think. The primary performance advantage of Dshot is that it prevents background noise from changing the throttle signals. If your copter has a lot of background noise, you're probably going to see a big improvement in motor smoothness and perhaps in flight handling when you go to Dshot. But if your copter doesn't have a lot of noise, multi-shot may already be doing a fantastic job. You may not notice much difference going to Dshot. So Dshot is not guaranteed to give you a night and day difference, but you won't know till you try it. And at the end of the day, going to Dshot does get rid of that pesky motor calibration. So even if the flight performance is not improved, it's still a convenience feature. Or is it? Because, I mean, Betaflight 3.1 isn't even out yet. And who knows if your flight controller supports it, yada, yada, yada. I'll come back to that. Maybe Dshot's worse than multi-shot. Maybe it's worse. There's certainly been some, when Dshot first came out, Preston from Raceflight was like, well, we're going to stick with multi-shot because Dshot can't do 32K on most devices. And it's interesting because Dshot 600 can do 32 kilohertz. But actually, and this is Preston who said this, I say in my Raceflight dev, that's Preston who says this. He says that when they try to run Dshot 600 at 32 kilohertz, they have problems. I don't have details on what the problems are. And this is interesting because, as far as I know, only the Raceflight Revolt will run a PID loop at 32 kilohertz. Nobody else bothers because the gyro doesn't go that fast. So I would not be surprised to find out that KISS and Betaflight are developing Dshot based on PID loop speeds of 8 kilohertz or less. And as I said, there's still an advantage to doing Dshot 600 at the lower PID loop speeds because the shorter pulses still give an advantage. But when you get up to the 16K and 32K speeds, that's I don't know how much testing has been done on that. I really don't, on the Betaflight side. But the Raceflight guys, who are the primary guys who are running 32K PID loops now, what Preston told me is that he feels like that multi-shot is preferred at those speeds. So if you're running Raceflight, you can choose to run Dshot if you want to. But if you're running the Raceflight Revolt with 32K PID loops, you might prefer to do multi-shot instead. Try both. I don't know. What about in extreme noise scenarios? Well, with Dshot, noise destroys the frame and the value is completely lost. With analog protocols, noise changes the value, but the value still gets through. And so I think clearly there, the Dshot scenario is better. Some people on the internet paint the picture of, with Dshot, the frame is completely destroyed. But with analog protocols, you get close to the right value. It just changes a little. And that's not, I don't think that's true. Because it's a complete crapshoot where in the frame, where in the pulse, the noise destroys the data. So maybe you're sending a 1500 microsecond pulse and the noise clips it off at 1400 and it's still pretty close to what it was going to be, maybe. But it's just a completely random. Maybe it cuts it off at 1000. Maybe it cuts it off at some invalid value. You never know. So I think Dshot's better in extreme noise scenarios in terms of would you rather lose all the data or would you rather just slightly change the data? The other question that's worth asking is corruption more likely with Dshot? Well, you got this digital protocol. It's all complicated. It's got ones and zeros. Does that make it more fragile? No. Digital protocols can be designed to be more robust and more noise resistant, even though they're also more complicated. That complication, robustness is designed in Okay, they can be more fragile if they're badly designed, but Dshot has specifically been designed to deal with noise. Notice that the frame length of a Dshot 600 and a Multishot frame is about the same if we go back to that previous slide. So the chance of noise occurring during the frame window is the same. The fact that the Dshot signal is doing a bunch of ones and zeros and the Multishot signal is just sending a fixed pulse, that doesn't really matter. The chance of a noise event occurring while that is being transmitted is the same. And then the only question is whether one is more susceptible to corruption than the other. The frame length of Dshot 300 or Dshot 150 versus Multishot is much longer, though, as much as roughly 4 times longer for Dshot 150. So that means if the frame is 4 times longer, it's 4 times as likely that you're going to experience corruption in that window. But Dshot being a digital protocol may be and is more resistant to corruption from noise. So that's the unquantifiable thing there. It's 4 times more likely to be corrupted because the frame is longer, but then how much less likely is it to be corrupted because it's a well-designed digital protocol? And I don't know the answer to that. So what's the final word? Dshot still has many hurdles to entry. If you want to do Dshot right now, and you're not lucky enough to already have gear that supports it easily, then you got to do a bunch of screwing around to get it to work. At the very least, if you're a Betaflight, you have to flash Betaflight 3.1, which is not even in alpha yet. It's not even out of alpha yet. It's not even, there's not a release candidate. So the hurdles to entry. Multishot, and especially unsynced Multishot at between 8K and 32K, it probably outperforms Dshot 150 and Dshot 300 on many quads. And what I mean by that is that if you have a clean quad with not a lot of noise, then the shorter pulse length of Multishot is going to give you better performance. And the fact that Dshot 150 and Dshot 300 are more noise resistant isn't going to matter much because you don't have much noise to begin with. Dshot 600 is probably no worse than Multishot on many quads, and on noisy quads it's probably much better. So if you're running Multishot and it's a noisy environment, and if you can run Dshot 600, you're probably doing a lot better with Dshot. Digital motor protocols are coming. They're the future. Analog ones are going to go away. It'll just be the way we do things in, I'd say 6 months because this hobby moves fast. Probably by summer, everybody will be using digital and nobody will be using Multishot anymore. And that'll just be where we're at. So if you're not sure right now whether Dshot is for you, just go take a nap. And by the time you wake up, you just buy a $10 Dshot ESC from Banggood and that'll be that. Dshot is not a must-have feature today, though. Dshot is not. There are scenarios where Dshot is going to significantly improve your handling. I think there are people out there who are running, maybe they're running one shot right now, and they have a very noisy copter. If they were to go to Dshot, then probably they would see a big improvement. But they could probably go to Multishot if you're running BL. So if you're going to go to Dshot, then you're running BLHeli-S. And if you're running BLHeli-S, then there's zero reason for you not to go to Multishot. You should be running Multishot. If you have BLHeli-S and you're running one shot and not Multishot, run Multishot. What are you thinking? Go down. It's better. And now you understand why. So if you're running BLHeli-S with Multishot, I think that you have to really want Dshot, but it's not a must-have. And if you wait just a little bit, then it'll be easy for you to get into it and you won't have to jump through any hoops. That's my opinion, and that's now you know about Dshot. The next thing you should do if you really want Dshot after all of this is you should go to the Betaflight wiki, assuming you're a Betaflight user, and you should start reading about which flight controllers and which ESCs support Dshot and what you got to do to get into it. Good luck with that. Hope this has all been very educational. Thanks for watching. Happy flying.